John Howard, Professor Frame, scholars, guests and friends. It's a privilege to be invited to address this Howard Government Retrospective 1996 conference. I do remember the year well. In fact, I remember the night before the election meeting John Howard at Cafe Stavel and giving him details of the final news poll. In those days, of course, the polls got it right. I salute Tom Frame for his ambitious project to create a Howard Centre dedicated to prime ministerial history. That's a subject close to my own heart. It's also an honour to share the platform this morning with David Kemp and Andrew Robb, who've left such an imprint on Australian politics, people whom I've known now for several decades. I want to begin by saying there was nothing inevitable about the Howard government, or what can legitimately be called the Howard era. If you'd suggested in early 1996 to a round table of astute observers that John Howard would win 4 elections and become the second longest serving Prime Minister to Sir Robert Menzies, you would have been dismissed as delusional. While people expected Mr Howard to win the election, they did not expect such a successful Prime Ministership. I recall the mood of the time. And this highlights the first challenge, not just of this conference, but of this entire historical project, to explain the Howard era, how and why it happened, and why it was so successful. In 1996, the coalition had been in opposition for 13 long, bitter years. Much of this period had been marked by Liberal Party division and ineptitude. There was no certainty whatsoever that the Liberals, if they won, could construct a meaningful period of government. I believe that much of the foundation for this success lies in 1996, the first year. It's true there were other more dramatic and more eventful years in John Howard's Prime Ministership, but a strong case can be made that 1996 was the most important year. It laid the foundations, and the foundations endured. And this is the theme for my remarks today, 1996 as the foundational year. Almost from the start, 2 of the dominant ideas and practical themes of the Howard era were apparent. Both were deeply cherished by John Howard and went to his core identity. They were his commitment to market and fiscally based economic reform designed to improve the living standards of the people, and the belief in a cultural traditionalism to challenge the values and political correctness of the Labor era. Both these ideas, economic and cultural, confronted the Keating legacy at its essence. They became the source of a huge debate about what John Howard stood for, and they left no doubt that Howardism was rooted in beliefs and ideas, and that the Howard era was based on a vision about the nation. It took a lot of people some time to recognise this, and when they did, of course, they didn't like the vision. In this sense, John Howard was both a pragmatist and a conviction leader. And the point to make about cultural traditionalism is that over the long period of government, it had many manifestations. These were not just ideas, of course, but for a practical politician like John Howard, they turned into a strategy to maintain majority government. The foundations of success originated in leadership. The leadership transition of 1995 involved 3 men and, in a sense, a de facto compact. Howard, the incoming leader, who became Prime Minister, Peter Costello as Deputy, who became Treasurer, Alexander Downer, the resigning leader who became Foreign Minister. And this arrangement proved to be extraordinarily enduring, these three figures remaining in their positions for the entire period of the government and underwriting a period of leadership stability that the Liberals had not seen since the Menzies age. And of course, this leadership transition of 1995 was driven by a party in desperation, fearful that it would lose a sixth election to the Labor Party. Ultimately, the key to success lay in the recalled leader. John Howard came back stronger than he'd been during his first leadership period, 85 to 89. He'd reflected deeply on his mistakes in the first period. And I think the single most important lesson that he'd absorbed was the need to govern for the entire party. Howard, as leader, was no longer a spokesman for the Liberal Dries, he was a spokesman for the Liberal Party. From his return, he operated on the principle of the Liberals as a broad church. And over the years, as Prime Minister, he developed the inclusive philosophy of the party as embodying the two great traditions, Liberal and Conservative. The record shows that Howard exercised a remarkable authority and achieved an unusual degree of enduring unity over 11 years. This was the indispensable condition for success in office. From today's perspective, looking at the chronic prime ministerial and leadership instability since 2007, I think this result looms as even more remarkable. There are four aspects of the 1996 campaign I want to highlight. First, Howard showed he could match Paul Keating in personal political combat. This was vital. Second, Howard and Andrew Robb were ruthless in their tactics. They gave Keating no opening, accepting Medicare, rejecting a GST, holding back their policies to deny Keating a long demolition campaign. When their policies were released, they were essentially modest, no fight-back heroics. John Howard was not elected on a glorious reformist program. He cut his cloth to the times. Third, Howard's insights in Robb's campaign gave effect to a realignment in Australian politics. The defection of a significant section of Labor supporters was fundamental to the election result. These supporters felt that the Keating government's values and outlook had forsaken traditional Labor voters, whose economic and family needs and struggles were being forgotten. The Liberal campaign penetrated and exposed the Labor base. Working class, lower middle class and Catholic voters came to the Liberals. The election result changed the voting demographic for the Liberal Party, and it saw John Howard put his imprint on the party. It created the Howard battlers, embodied above all in the seat of Lindsay. It helped to create the Howard governing model. It gave Howard an interpretation of Australia that guided his decisions and judgment in office. The legacy of the 1996 election was enduring. It was not just a victory, it was a realignment. And my fourth point about the election, the numbers mattered, they always matter, and the margin was large. Howard built a big majority in the House, a larger majority than what Tony Abbott obtained at the 2013 election. Critically, Howard had 37 senators, just short of a majority, giving him the chance to secure negotiated passages of bills, compared with Abbott's far weaker 33 senators after the 2013 election. The point to make about this is that Howard's parliamentary platform gave him an enduring strength. and this was proved when he survived the loss of a substantial number of seats at the 1998 election. Interpreting the 1996 election from today's perspective, the result delivered Howard a very, very significant degree of political capital, which, if used properly, would enable him to govern with authority. And essentially, he did take the potential involved in that. Australia had changed in the 13 years the coalition had spent in opposition. It had a new Parliament House, a 24-hour media cycle, floating currency, a disappearing tariff, and an increasingly multicultural society. From the start, it was a Howard government. It's best understood as the latest example of an enhancement of the Australian model of prime ministerial government. A unique Australian evolution, not Washington, not Westminster. Howard arrived naked but for himself. He had no mentors, no guiding philosopher, no blueprint for action. He learnt on the job, improvised as he went. I sometimes compared him at the start to an opening batsman under pressure, confident yet wary, judging the pace, scoring off some deliveries, yet missing others, improving gradually as he went. Looking back in retrospect, however, I think there were 4 very important policy foundations laid for the government at the start. I'll briefly highlight them. The first was the economic structure, the economic model, the approach to fiscal policy. This was decided essentially very early on. The economic policy approach that Howard, elected in 1996, took revealed in many ways that he was a man of the 1980s, anxious to complete in office a 1980s agenda that he'd been so preoccupied by. The fiscal consolidation strategy was designed to deliver a budget surplus. It was given initial expression in the 1996 budget. Peter Costello brought down 12 budgets, but the most important, I believe, was 1996. The first, the foundation stone. It was also a dangerous moment. History invites a comparison between the 1996 and 2014 budgets. The economic position faced by Howard and Costello was more favourable than that faced by Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey, but their performance, economically and politically, was far superior. Howard and Costello said their budget was necessary, tough, but fair. The backlash was bitter, it was emotional, and it got violent. The government took some political hits, but it got through. The combination of strong economic growth and the 1996 budget positioned the economy for the long, golden, surplus years. Howard and Costello ran a surplus government. This was their identity. That meant economic power, political options, and electoral kudos. The surplus defined and made the Howard era. It was the issue, by the way, on which they ruined the Labor Party for a decade. Second policy foundation I want to highlight is the formalisation of Reserve Bank independence and the appointment of Ian Macfarlane as Governor, I believe the single most important appointment of the Howard years. All done again in the very early days of office. The Howard government thrived on the death of inflation as both a global and domestic event. The bank's monetary management prolonged the growth cycle and was fundamental in negotiating a series of crises that successfully kept Australia short of recession. The idea of Reserve Bank independence and its astonishing benefits became central to Howard Costello economic success. Third policy idea, labour market deregulation. The Howard government in its history did 2 major labour market reforms, the Reith-Curnow 1996 Compromise Bill, and then the full Monty, work choices in 2005. John Howard was always pledged to labour market reform, and in Peter Reith he found a dedicated agent. I think the Reith-Curnow Bill was a defining event, more important than is usually recognised in policy terms. It was critical to Howard's economic beliefs and political vision. It was a coalition Australian Democrats deal. Reith carried it, Greg Combay conceded. It was a significant reform. And the fourth and final reform I want to highlight was the Guns Initiative. This was a judgment which arose out of the Port Arthur massacre, a decision taken by John Howard, but a judgment that reflected his view of Australia, its values, its enduring practical norms. Again, it was a risky decision for the government, popular with the people, but causing immense tribulation within the coalition and within the National Party. Looking back, there's no doubt that it looms as one of the significant and defining achievements of the government in terms of its values. Now, just finishing up, I've been asked to look at what mistakes might have been made by the Howard government. And as a political journalist, I have no problems, unlike Andrew Robb, identifying mistakes. The point I'd make is that at the end of 1996, there was a sense of uncertainty about the mixed performance of the Howard government. And that uncertainty focused around a number of questions. What was its guiding mission and how competent was it? Let's look at mistakes. I think the brutal sacking of 6 departmental heads at the start was counterproductive. I wouldn't have objected to a couple. I didn't object to the arrival of Max Moore-Wilton, but sacking the 6 was unjustified and injected bad blood into government public service relations. Second mistake. The flawed ministerial code mentioned by Andrew Robb, unveiled by John Howard on his first day in Parliament, the code contributed to him losing 5 ministers and bringing his government to the brink of convulsion in its first term. John Howard learnt from this, but he did pay a terrific political price. Third mistake, I'd like to refer to the Pauline Hanson phenomenon. You can't discuss 1996 without referring to Hansonism. She gave her maiden speech in September 1996, and of course that led to a very significant challenge to the survival of the Howard government. I agreed with John Howard's approach that it was right to safeguard and protect his conservative base, to deny Hansonism political oxygen, to play down, not play up her impact. I do, however, have criticisms of his approach within that framework. I believe Hanson was challenging fundamental principles of Australian society, and I think she should have been rebuffed on these principles by the Prime Minister far earlier. It was not until May 1997 that Howard offered his first sustained critique of Hanson, and I do think that damaged his standing and image as Prime Minister. So in conclusion, I have 3 overall points. At the time, 1996 was seen as a solid start for the Howard government, but not necessarily a convincing opening year. Secondly, it clearly saw from the start the emergence of 2 of the fundamental ideas that would dominate the Howard era: market and fiscal-based economic reform, and a faith in cultural traditionalism to challenge progressive norms. And finally, in retrospect, we see that 1996 was the foundational year. It provided much of the platform for the future remarkable success of the Howard government.
Your questions, please. John Neddick.
John Nethercote, thanks very much, Paul, for a characteristically insightful paper. I don't suppose it'll surprise you to know that I want to discuss the permanent heads. Can I just make a few points on that? I don't agree with what you said, because I think that the mood of the time was extremely hostile to the arrival of the Howard government, the public service mood of the time, extremely hostile to the arrival of the Howard government, and the sort of sentiment that was involved, I think, reading from the papers at the weekend, is admirably captured with the sort of sentiments that in which Troy Bramston appears to have written in his book. I think that the removal of the permanent heads became symbolic rather than being causative. I think it was the culmination of 25 years of attacking the tenured leadership of the public service, started by the Whitlam government, reinforced by John Menzies, who thought that in '72 the big mistake had been not to sack the lot. I think that's in his memoirs. And the deal was sealed by 1994 legislation making it possible for governments to remove heads of department and simply to pay them compensation. And I think the forgotten point in the whole business is that all the successes came either from within the public service or they were ex-public servants of very senior rank, of whom Maxwell Wilton was an obvious case.
Look, I accept all those points, John, and they're very effective and forceful points. I would, however, stand by my conclusion. I think that the removals went too far, and I think some of them were manifestly unfair, and I think they did, in net terms, have a counterproductive impact for quite a long time in terms of government-public service relations.
Another question. Nick Kane. Oh, sorry, that's not. This way. Right here. Quick question.
Paul, I'm interested in this question of transition to government, which Andrew Robb picked up as being, it was possibly a failure in Andrew Robb's description. And yet, I mean, as you've described it, and as we remember the Howard years, the transition to government looked remarkably efficient and well prepared compared to some more recent governments. Would you like to comment on that?
I think the point is essentially correct. There's no doubt that the Howard government transition, from opposition to government in 1996 was immeasurably more successful than the Abbott transition from opposition to government. The latter, I think, was a very troubled transition for a number of reasons we don't need to go into, but the point I'd make for the historical record is that, coming back to my central theme, I think 1996 is the foundational year, because we've got to bear in mind how much can go wrong. This is the point I argued. Labor had been in government for a long period of time. You could not assume that the Howard government was going to be successful. You could not assume there was going to be a successful transition. And essentially, you look at the performance of 1996, and as I said, it was solid. It wasn't totally convincing. There were a number of mistakes. But when you look back in retrospect, as far as I'm concerned, the story of 1996 is the foundations are laid. The foundations are laid then for what could be a long period of successful government, provided the government continues to govern effectively and competently, and it did. And that subsequent success means you'll look back on 1996, as far as I'm concerned, as the foundational year.
Dr. Nelson.
Paul, thank you, Paul. The other dimension, perhaps, which validated what you've said is the Lindsay by-election, which was held only 6 months after the budget, which I think more than a 6% swing to the government, as I recall.
Well, I think that's really right, Brendan, and it highlights the point that the government, in its first year, took a lot of tough decisions. I mean, the first budget this is a dangerous moment. The first budget was a dangerous moment. A lot of things could have gone wrong, and it looked at various stages as though they might go wrong. But essentially, the budget was pretty well judged in terms of the balance between toughness and fairness, and the selling of the budget by the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, I think, was highly effective, and so the government retained public support. I can't remember exactly when the Lindsay by-election was held, but the second election, but it verified the point. I think this is correct, that the government was able to maintain a significant degree of public support during a period in which it was taking very difficult decisions. And once again, the contrast between 2013-14 is pretty conspicuous.
Thank you, Paul. Would you please join with me in thanking Paul?